Why? What? Two one-word questions, which is at the heart of many discussions. In this particular discussion, we're pointing those whys and whats at the Fireflies. Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat, and today we're taking a deep dive into what makes the Fireflies tick. What is their ultimate goal? Is that goal even attainable? What are they really doing? And finally, is it even worth it to keep fighting? Before we begin, I'd just like to thank Castat37, a member of the TheiPadCat Discord server, for this video idea. If you want me to do a video on something, just discuss The Last of Us or other games with me or other like-minded people, or be a part of future streams on this channel, make sure to join it through the link in the description. Oh, and if there's any problems with the link, be sure to tell me in the comments. This video is going to be quite long, so don't expect the most amazing editing, but stick around. I have some interesting stuff to say. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's begin. So those are a lot of questions. Let's start by going over what the Fireflies are and what, at least initially, their goal was. In the early days of the outbreak, when the world had not yet completely fallen apart, the fictional counterpart of the real disaster agency, FEMA, in the USA, FEDRA, was called in, presumably by the government. As circumstances quickly deteriorated, and with no vaccine on the horizon, things got out of hand. Martial law was declared in most cities, and sometime shortly after the outbreak, we can assume FEDRA completely seized control of what was left of the country and the government, i.e. the military and the established quarantine zones. This angered a lot of people who didn't want to live in a military dictatorship, and thus riots broke out. Eventually, the rioters got more organized and ended up forming their own opposition faction to reinstate a democratic government and eventually restoring the country itself. That faction is what we know as the Fireflies. Now, most of this is based on the minute-long intro credits scene, which means I had to fill in some of the blanks myself, and unfortunately, or really fortunately, because that is what makes The Last of Us so good, most of the focus on the game lies on Joel and Ellie. Thus, we don't get that much information on other things, like the Fireflies. But what we can gather from this is that the Fireflies were formed really early on, presumably in the initial months, definitely in the first year of the outbreak, as we actually hear what sounds as reporters from some sort of news broadcast telling us this information.
A group calling themselves the Fireflies have claimed responsibility for both attacks.
Their public charter calls for the return of all branches of government.
Demonstrations broke out following the execution of 6 more alleged Fireflies.
What's really interesting is that finding a vaccine wasn't at all part of their agenda when they formed. Of course, it could be interpreted as a part of the restoring country part of it, but it definitely sounds more like they were a political group opposing FEDRA and their methods of running what was left of the US, rather than the science-focused rebels we see in most of the story. What happened? We even meet the leader of the Fireflies on multiple occasions, and never do we once hear any rambling of how oppressive FEDRA is or how important it is to reinstate democracy. No, we only hear about the vaccine. Now, I see two possible reasons for why this is the case. One, our mission for the Fireflies doesn't have anything to do with their other goals of their organization, and thus we don't hear anything about it. But one would think that the leader of the probably second biggest faction in post-outbreak America would be a bit more ideological. Or two, that the Fireflies have just been going downhill between the prologue and the main game, and are basically on their last legs, going after their last hope, a vaccine. I can't say for sure which one of these two alternatives is the most likely. It really could be any of them. So, to finish up this part of the video and answer the question, what is the Fireflies' ultimate goal? Well, during the early days they were aspiring to reinstate democracy and restore the US to its former glory.
I
Fireflies were everywhere, huh?
Yeah, they were. Hoping to restore the country to what it was.
But during the campaign and in part 2, I don't know. The obvious answer is of course finding a vaccine, but is that really all? Moving on, we have the question as to if these goals are even attainable or if the Fireflies are just grasping at nothing. From what we learn in the game, killing Ellie could most likely have led to producing a vaccine. So yes, that specific goal could have been attained, but the question following that one is, what good would it do? I realize it sounds ridiculous when I say it. I mean, why wouldn't it do any good? Finally, people can be safe from the infection. But is it really that simple? In fact, there are several complications to overcome after making a working vaccine. How in the world would the Fireflies mass produce it? It is very clearly implied that the only faction left in the world with some sort of industrial capacity is FEDRA.
So, why don't you fix one of these cars?
Oh my god, you're a genius. I mean, the whole time, why on earth hadn't I thought about fixing one of these cars?
Okay, don't be a dick.
Their tires are rotted and their batteries are dead.
Are you done?
Can't even begin to think what the inside of the engine blocks look like. Only ones making new car batteries are the military.
All of the other factions we see seem to get by scavenging and stealing. Although I won't deny the possibility of the Fireflies coming up with a way to mass produce it. After all, they are the second biggest and most powerful faction. But okay, let's say the Fireflies have found a way to get enough vaccine. How would they distribute it? To who would they distribute it? Would they use it as leverage to get power over other people or factions? Or would they just give it away? Given that most factions seem to be hostile to every other faction, I don't see how most people in the country would even be able to get their hands on vaccine, other than maybe trying to take it from the Fireflies. Most remaining people in the US probably are within the factions hostile to the Fireflies, most notably the FEDRA quarantine zones and hunter groups. So yeah, maybe the Fireflies could produce a vaccine and manage to mass produce it, but I don't see how anything good could come from it other than that all the members of the Fireflies and some survivors and minor factions not hostile to them would now be immune. In an ideal world, the discovery of a vaccine would be a unifying force, making everyone drop their weapons and fall in line behind the saviors of mankind, the Fireflies. But The Last of Us isn't an ideal world. It's far from an ideal world. But let's ignore that and let's say that the vaccine manages to reach everyone in the country either by distribution from the Fireflies or other factions stealing it. How would this help restore everything to what it was? Everything has been going backwards for the last 25 years in The Last of Us' universe. People have been reduced to savage murderers. Even what's left of the government is a brutal and oppressive dictatorship. Not to mention that the country is literally crumbling. 25 years without modern maintenance and repairs have taken its toll on the infrastructure. A vaccine could certainly be of some immediate assistance, but it wouldn't solve anything beyond that. How would everyone just go back to the way things were? The Walking Dead Season 5 is a great example of this. After the prison fell and Rick and his group were forced out into the brutal world for several months and then suddenly found themselves in a place, Alexandria, where people were just acting as if nothing had happened since the outbreak and tried to get Rick and company to do the same, conflict arose. And that was just within one single settlement. Now imagine the same but in the entire United States. You can't just go back. I'm not saying it's impossible, but not in the way the Fireflies seem to want, or at least wanted to do it. So that might be what the Fireflies want or wanted to do, but what were they and what are they actually doing in practice? We know the faction started out as rioters, and I'm willing to say they haven't really moved on from that past. The country is in pieces. Everyone just wants to be safe from the infected and people taking advantage of the lawlessness. And what do the Fireflies do?
Get out of here! Close it up! Fireflies!
They put the very last bastion of that safety, even though it might be a corrupt and oppressive place, in danger. In the name of what? Old world ideals or democracy? Or just plain dissatisfaction? How are they going to reinstate the US and save the people if there is no one left to save when they've destroyed all the quarantine zones and let all the people who can't fend for themselves die? How does it further their goals? In Pittsburgh, all it did was backfire in their face when the hunters didn't buy any of their idealism and killed them all after they defeated the military. And in the end, they ended up with being further away from their goal of restoring the country, because Pittsburgh turned into a less civilized place where no one but the hunters are allowed to live, and everybody else is just killed. Why do they do it? Just for being politically opposed to FEDRA. That makes them nothing more than violent revolutionaries blinded by their vision of utopia. Finally, what's the point of fighting then, if they can't achieve anything they're striving for? Well, this is where we go into philosophical territory. Realistically speaking, what the Fireflies want to do is not really possible. It's not impossible, but very unlikely. So one could say that there is no point to it. Why not just ditch the other motives and just focus on surviving instead? With a group that large, they'd be very good at it. But then again, you can go on forever with that statement. What's the point of surviving then? If it's never going to get better, isn't it just better to lay down and die? What's the point in still being in a group if it's never going to go further than that, never evolving into the civilization they once knew? Let's just go our separate ways then. I don't think that argument holds up. People need purpose. It's the same thing in the real world. Nihilism is just a way to depression and nothingness. Some people find that purpose in religion, some in family, some in striving for a better world, regardless of if that strive is impossible in the end. Look, I know I sound really negative and critical of the Fireflies, but in the end, I'm actually a fan of them. They aren't the good guys many people consider them, but they aren't the bad guys either. I think that despite them being naive and brutal, their cause is a noble one. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Do you agree with my points? Disagree? Do you think that there is a point to the Fireflies keeping on fighting despite the world doing its best to just die? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a great day.